Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Schadenberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. Today, I have with me Gordon MacDonald from Scotland, and he is the CEO, or he's the man who leads the Care Not Killing Alliance, Care Not Killing Coalition or Group Alliance in the UK, opposing assisted suicide and euthanasia. I've known him for quite a few years because he's been involved with these issues for quite a few years, because this issue has been debated in the UK for many, many years. The last bill that went to a serious vote was in 2015. So, and also, as I say, there's been bills in Scotland, etc., that he's been dealing with and fighting and working to create coalition partners to oppose these killing initiatives is a better way to put it. So we will take questions at the end, so everyone knows that now. There are more people who will join us as the event goes on. Gordon has, anyway, I could actually let him begin, but he's, as I say, he's been a leader for quite a few years. They work with physicians, they work with people with disabilities, they work with people from faith groups, they work from people from all walks of life in England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and to oppose euthanasia and assisted suicide. He's also part of a key group of people in Europe who have been creating turning strategies to effectively present this issue in Europe. So thank you, Gordon. Please take over and offer us your information.
Okay. Well, thank you, Alex, and thanks for inviting me to come along today and just share with you a little bit about what's been happening in the UK and the wider British Isles. As many of you may be aware, we have been facing a number of bills in the UK. We have a devolved system of government, so it's a bit like the Canadian provinces, and euthanasia or assisted suicide is a power that is devolved to the Scottish Parliament. It's not devolved to the Welsh Assembly, so the UK Parliament at Westminster legislates for both England and Wales on this issue. But it is also, we also have what's called crown dependencies in the UK. So, well, sorry, not in the UK, but in the British Isles. So we have, for example, the Isle of Man is a crown dependency, and the Channel Islands, Jersey, is a crown dependency, as is Guernsey. And so there is also legislation proceeding in both the Isle of Man and in Jersey at the moment as well. And then in Ireland, which obviously is an independent state, but still part of the wider British Isles in that sense, there has been proposals for a bill in the Republic of Ireland, not in Northern Ireland. That is currently stalled, but it was making quite a lot of progress before the election in Ireland. So that's a sort of brief summary of the overview of the situation.
Yes. Can you first talk about what's going on right now in Westminster in the British Parliament with the Kim Leadbeater bill, the assisted suicide bill? And I'm going to make one comment very quickly. That bill is a private member's bill, but I and you are under no illusion that it's actually per se a private member's bill, because the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, strongly supports the bill. As much as it's been presented as a private member's bill, it is almost similar, if not almost completely the same as the government bill.
Yeah, it is in the sense that it obviously has the political backing of the Prime Minister. The previous Prime Minister didn't really make a public commitment one way or the other. All previous Prime Ministers before him have been opposed. So the fact that we now have a Prime Minister who is, with a large majority, who is very strongly committed to this issue and has been for some number of years, he voted for the last bill that was debated in the House of Commons back in 2015, is obviously problematic. The government is officially neutral, but what has been happening quite clearly and has emerged is that the government departments, the Department of Health and Department of Justice, have been facilitating Kim Leadbeater's amendments that she's been bringing forward. They've been drafting them, and they've been giving advice to her on that. Now, the ministers who are on the committee representing those departments both voted in favour of the bill. They say that they are there representing the government, and so they're there for They are to ensure that the bill, as if it's passed, is workable. So that's essentially their position. They're saying the government is neutral, but when it has come to votes on the amendments, they have consistently voted with Kim Leadbeater and those members of Parliament on the committee who are supporting her position, and therefore most of the amendments which have been put forward by our side have been heavily defeated, including the two government ministers who've been sitting on the bill committee have been voting against them. So I think it is legitimate to question what neutrality actually means. There may be no official whip being applied, but I think it's quite clear, as we all know in politics, that there can be unofficial pressures or encouragements, or even just that politicians see an opportunity. If they are a bit undecided on the issue, they don't want to upset the leader of the party or the prime minister, because that can have a detrimental effect on their future prospects.
So just for the listeners, I want to clarify that the bill right now, it had passed its second reading, and you might want to comment on the vote, how it went, but also now it's in committee, and that's why you were talking about the proposed amendments that were being discussed. So it's the same as the Canadian system in that sense, that we have a bill that will go through after it has a second reading vote. It will go to committee where they'll discuss amendments to the bill, and then a final version of the bill would come out for its final reading, which would be third reading.
Yeah, the bill had its second reading vote in the House of Commons on the 29th of November. There was a majority of 55 supporting the bill. 600 MPs turned out to vote, which was a very high percentage for a private member's bill. So there's obviously a lot of engagement on this issue, but you have to remember we had a general election in July last year, and a large number of new MPs were elected. This was really almost the first issue that they were forced to vote on and address. There were a few other issues, but it's clearly the most controversial, most significant issue that they've been presented with so far. So that majority of 55, in some ways, although it seems quite a large majority, it wasn't as high as we were first feared it would be. You know, with a new parliament, a new government with a very large majority, you know, it could have been a lot worse. And so I think there is everything to fight for. The committee has been, the bill committee was set up to look at it. Kim Leadbeater herself was able to propose the members of the bill committee. So there is an inbuilt majority who favour the bill, and some of the MPs who we would have argued should have been on the committee who were opposed to the bill because they had a lot of experience, were not included. So I think it's not been a great surprise to us the way the bill committee has developed in terms of its voting record and what's happened at the committee. But there has been a feeling that throughout the process that this is being rushed. First of all, there was a very quick vote at second reading. Then there has been this opportunity to submit evidence to the committee. That only lasted for a couple of weeks before the committee started meeting. I mean, it's still possible to submit evidence right up until the committee stops meeting, but obviously the evidence that was submitted before the committee started meeting is the evidence that's most likely to be read and considered by the members of the committee. They then had really only 3 days of oral evidence sessions, and they've been having back-to-back meetings since then, looking at amendments and going through the bill clause by clause. So it's been quite a grueling process, I suspect, for those who've been on it, but it's all been rushed and pushed through, and that's the impression that you're getting. And they're not really taking the time that they should be taking to consider such a sensitive and difficult issue, in my view.
So when is the third reading vote scheduled for? Because I have looked at this myself, and I'm not, part of the British system, but I look at the Canadian system, which is identical to the British political system, and I'm surprised that they haven't delayed things, considering the amount of committee time that's been needed so far to go through all these amendments that have been suggested. And we will go through the amendments in a minute, or at least some of the amendments in a minute. When is the scheduled third reading vote?
Well, what's called report stage is scheduled for the 25th of April. Now, report stage is when the whole chamber, the whole House considers amendments. Now, normally what would happen with a private member's bill is that the third reading would happen immediately after report stage on the same day. However, there is some indication that that might not happen on this occasion, and that we might be seeing a separation between report stage and third reading in terms of timescale, and that we might be looking at a third reading debate in May, possibly mid-May, maybe towards the end of May. But that's not confirmed yet, and we'll just have to wait and see what happens. I suspect on this issue that it is so controversial, obviously, and that a lot of people will want to have their say. So I suspect that there might be a split between report stage and third reading.
A lot of people sent us those submissions. I know there's been some analysis of those submissions, but when I actually look at the multiple amendments that have been proposed and defeated, it appears to me that the committee wasn't actually concerned so much about the input from people writing in with expert information or certainly experiences, because it doesn't seem to reflect in the votes on the committee.
Yeah, I think I would say that I mean, it's hard to say this because we obviously have encouraged people to submit written evidence, and I think it is right that we do that, and people have their say and they express their view. But I think it is certainly been the case that much of the written evidence has probably not been thoroughly scrutinized by committee members, would be my guess. And when it has come to the oral evidence, the overwhelming majority of the oral witnesses, particularly all those from overseas, were supportive of assisted suicide. And again, the bill sponsor was able to choose who would give oral evidence. In contrast, the overwhelming majority of the written evidence was opposed. So you can make of that as you will, but I would say that the minds have already been made up by most of the members of the committee, and the key issue is the MPs who are not on the committee, and what they are actually thinking rather than the ones who are on the committee.
Right, and actually, you said this before. The committee was chosen by Kim Leadbeater herself, and therefore she made sure that those who were strongly on board were on the committee for the yes side, you could say. Whereas the no side, uh, I do notice, of course, that Danny Kruger is on the committee, and there's a few others, but for the most part, the no side might have should have had possibly a few other people on it too, and it wasn't, as you already said. So I'm just repeating what you said. But when you choose a committee which is overwhelmingly yes and committed to being yes, obviously speaking, that's not going to be necessarily representative of the parliament itself.
Well, if you consider that the vote, as I said, I can't remember the exact figures, but the numbers were essentially, it was a majority of
330
55.
to 275, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, you're really looking at 55% to 45% or something like that in terms of those who voted.
Yep.
But on the committee, it's breaking down about 15 votes for, as you described it, the yes side, and 8 or 9 depending on the actual amendment for the no side. So clearly, that proportion is much higher for the yes side on the committee than was the case at the second reading in the chamber.
I think it's important to look at this because some of this, the same thing, just so people know, the same thing happened in Canada. If you remember back in 2016, there were multiple amendments proposed to Bill C-14, which is the bill that legalized euthanasia in Canada. Multiple amendments, and they were all defeated. The only ones that were supported were the ones that the government actually had an interest in. So the one in the end that they did support was around on they supported several of these amendments that really, the one that they did support was that there would be a 5-year review of the legislation, but that actually never happened. The 5-year review wasn't a review to examine the law; it was a review to examine expansions of the law. But we had exactly the same thing in Canada. So here you have a situation of, for instance, I'll give you a prime example. The very first amendment, higher threshold for decision making. There was a motion on a higher threshold for decision making, was voted down 15-8. Prohibit encouraging someone towards assisted suicide. You would think that would be basic, prohibiting encouraging somebody. That was voted down 15-8. Prohibit undue influence. That was voted down 15-8. Prohibit manipulating someone to choose assisted suicide. That was voted down 15-8. So all these things are voted. Here's have a meeting with a palliative care specialist. So that was one amendment that said before a person can be approved, they should have a meeting with a palliative care specialist. That was voted down 15-8. These are the kind of things over and over again. And then people with disabilities, there was several motions, one about Down syndrome, one about assisted suicide for children, one about only people who ask for it should be allowed to have it brought up to them. All those things were voted down. In that case, there were 13 days. So two people must have been missing in those days. You know what I'm saying? But I shouldn't laugh, actually. But it's the truth of it is it's like quite one-sided.
Yeah, I would say very one-sided. And, there have been a number of amendments which have come from Kim's side, which have been accepted, obviously. I think there's maybe been one or two amendments proposed by those who tend to be opposed, that she said, well, she's willing to consider. But so far, as you can see from that list that you have there, Alex, that the vast majority that have been proposed, if not all of the ones that have been proposed from our side, have been rejected by, as you say, that 15-8, sometimes a wee bit higher, sometimes a wee bit lower.
Yeah, there's a few that she did accept, which is doctors must offer a palliative care referral. That means that they don't have to have one in any way. Patients must be informed of appropriate palliative care possibilities. That was accepted. Well, these are sort of like basic issues in a sense. So I think that we should actually talk about the one big amendment that Kim did accept, or did actually possibly propose, which is the original bill said that a judge would decide whether somebody would be approved for assisted dying, and then that was removed. You might want to comment on that.
Yeah, actually, the bill didn't actually specify that it would be a judge. It said that the High Court would decide. So it was unclear even from the beginning whether or not a judge would be the one making the decision. However, there was a bit of a backlash against that from the judiciary, and obviously the government were very concerned by that because they decided there just wasn't enough judicial time for that. There weren't enough judges. And so that amendment was brought forward to replace the judge, or the High Court as it was, with a panel of experts. Now, the panel which is being proposed, and that amendment has been accepted, will include either a retired judge or a King's Counsel, and a psychiatrist and a social worker. Now, the argument that was formally put forward was that this would enhance scrutiny, although we know that in reality it will reduce scrutiny, because the panel is not going to be at the outset of the process, it's going to be at the tail end of the process. And what was really driving this was this sort of backlash, both from the judiciary, but also within the Ministry of Justice, about the capacity of the system to cope with that. But we've got to remember that there is also a shortage of social workers and a shortage of psychiatrists in the UK, and people are waiting 2 months for a psychiatric appointment, or even longer sometimes for a social work referral. So where are these social workers and psychiatrists going to come from? And how are we going to ensure that this isn't just a rubber stamping exercise, which was what the concern was in any case about that.
But Gordon, does it say that you actually have to meet with the committee?
I don't think you have to actually meet with them, do you? They can meet with the person. They're not required to meet with the person. They're certainly not required to meet with family members or take advice from other experts. So the question is, and as I said, one of the big concerns about this panel is that it's at the end of the process. So already they will have had meetings with the two doctors involved will have approved them. And so in order for the panel to veto what's been approved by the two doctors, they would have to have very, very compelling grounds. And if you're not actually required to meet with the person, you don't know the person, you don't know what their family circumstances are, how do you know whether or not this individual is subject to domestic abuse or pressure, undue pressure, or has undiagnosed depression? That's not likely to come out. So I think the panel is actually a watering down of the so-called safeguard of the High Court, rather than.
I've referred to it as a death panel because in reality, it requires 3 people on the panel, but it doesn't in any way suggest that these Meaning the panel could be made up of 3 people, and they're the ones who go through every single request. It's just them, and therefore this is what they're doing. This is what they're hired to do. And I'm assuming that someone who is of the opinion that they're members of Care Not Killing Alliance would probably not be considered to be a member of that death panel.
Yeah, and that's one of the concerns, is that you have not only probably doctors who are predisposed to approve, but also the panel will be made up of people who will be predisposed to approve these
Correct.
cases.
Absolutely, that's what I'm thinking. So anyway, so you're telling me that the vote could happen in May, but the report is going to be submitted in April, later April. But this is sort of the timing we're at right now.
Yeah, and of course, after the third reading in the Commons, it will have to go to the House of Lords as well. And that's one of the reasons why there is so much pressure to push it through as quickly as possible, and not delay it to have a proper scrutiny, because if the bill does not finish its process through the Lords and the Commons by the dissolution of Parliament for the King's speech, then the bill will fall, and obviously those who support the bill know that. And because the Prime Minister is personally backing it, my guess will be that he will do everything he can to ensure that it does get to the end of the parliamentary process.
Very good. That's important. Now, this is anyway, we can move on a little bit. Are there any other issues that you think you should bring up with this? Because I think that the Leadbeater bill is a confusing bill in its construction. And I made this comment many times from the beginning. It appeared to me that this was a bill that was written to be more about euthanasia than assisted suicide. And then they decided to change their mind and they reconstructed it. That's how it actually looks to me. Because when you look at it sort of how it's together, it looks like it meant to be closer to Canada, but instead, because they didn't like what was happening in Canada, they thought that that could blow up in their face. They decided to go more towards the California, Oregon model. But it's sort of like a mixture. It's confusing to me how it actually comes together. And they use, of course, this term assisted dying, which of course is not a clear term per se. Now, it is limited to assisted suicide, and I'm not going to argue that. I'm just sort of saying that the construction is very awkward.
Well, I think you've got to understand that Kim Leadbeater was coming to this brand new. It's not an issue she's shown any interest in before. She had very little knowledge of it. She came top of the ballot, and because the Prime Minister had given a commitment to Esther Rantzen, this issue would be considered. There was obviously quite a lot of encouragement, shall we say, that she should pick this issue up for her bill, and that's what she's done. I would say that because of her lack of preparation in that sense, that she was sort of open to suggestions that were coming from other places.
Yep.
And the bill itself is quite interesting because it was drafted by the former Chief Parliamentary Counsel to the UK government, who had retired. But if you look at the drafting of the bill, it is actually very similar to the drafting of the Scottish bill in many parts. And that says to me that the Chief Parliamentary Counsel, or former Chief Parliamentary Counsel, who only had a couple of weeks to actually draft the bill, probably just looked at what had been published in Scotland in the bill that Liam MacArthur is putting forward. So I think that you need to look at, well, what's the source of Liam MacArthur's bill? What's he looking at? And he is looking at the Australian model. And obviously, they have backed off Canada, though Dignity and Dying in the UK were singing the praises of the Canadian system for a couple of years. They now don't mention Canada in their tweets any longer. Although we had Jocelyn Downey over from Canada at the Scottish Parliament saying that Canada had the best system in the world, but Scotland could have an even better system. Now those who are advocating for the change in the law don't want to talk about Canada, and they've started talking about Australia and saying, oh, well, no, we're basing this on Victoria in Australia, or we're basing it on
Well, it's not
New
the same as
Zealand.
Victoria, because Victoria requires you to be requesting. A
Yeah.
doctor can't ask you if you want this. You must request it yourself. There can't be an initiating procedure by the doctor. Now that's being changed right now. As you want, it's in the process of being changed right now in Victoria. So they're looking at Australia, but it's not really Australia. But Australia has been in such a short period of time of legalization. They haven't had the stories that Canada's had. And so I think that's probably why they're looking at Australia. The other thing you should know is Jocelyn Downey is a heavyweight now in Australia on the euthanasia issue. So it sort of makes sense that they would be looking at the Australian model in that sense.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to remember here is that what happened in with the Scottish bill. I don't want to get on to talking about Scotland too much, but it's because it's relevant to Westminster and the fact that I think they've just sort of picked up Scotland. But what happened was that they did actually consider whether it should be just assisted suicide or broader than that, and the coalition that were pushing the bill in Scotland were much broader than just dignity and dying. It included the humanists, included Friends at the end, who do favour, as far as I understand it, euthanasia, and also favour for non-terminal illnesses. So there's quite a lot of ambiguity in the Scottish bill, and particularly around this issue of what happens if the drugs don't work and the patient doesn't die. And when the Scottish bill was being drafted, there was a medical advisory group, and they essentially said that the doctor had to be present for the whole time until the patient died, so that they could ensure that the patient had a peaceful death. Now, they didn't clarify what exactly that meant, but they did say that it would mean putting in an emergency IV. And one of my colleagues asked Liam MacArthur, well, what's the purpose of the emergency IV? Is it to kill the patient or is it to resuscitate them? And he basically said, well, I'll just leave that up to the doctor. Now, that's the same position that's now being adopted at Westminster in the Bill Committee, because that same requirement that the doctor be present in the same building, not necessarily in the same room, until the death is in the Leadbeater Bill as well. And this came up this week in the committee. You know, what's the purpose of the doctor? What do they do in this situation where the patient doesn't die? And again, essentially the answer that was given was, well, we'll just leave that up to the professional judgment of the doctor. But clearly the doctor isn't legally allowed to kill the patient. So, there's a sort of ambiguity being left there, and sort of don't ask, don't tell type.
But that's the California model they're talking about now, because California is pushing to using the IV, and the purpose for the use of IV is to make sure that you can't distinguish between euthanasia and assisted suicide. So obviously the listeners wondering why we're talking about IV, and maybe the people listening who are live with us may not be confused about that, but other listeners who are going to be watching in the future might be. Euthanasia is usually done by inserting the IV, and then the drugs go through and into the body in that sense, right? So if you do assisted suicide by IV, they say the person will self-administer, meaning they will start the IV. But you can't distinguish between assisted suicide and euthanasia when you're using an IV, because obviously speaking, who actually does it? There's no oversight. The point of it is there's no oversight at the time of death. So therefore, if it's euthanasia or assisted suicide, you or I would never know. They'll call it assisted suicide, but it could very well be euthanasia because somebody else actually is carrying out the act. And the point that Gordon's referring to, so what happens when they have received the lethal drugs, the lethal poison, but they haven't died? Well, in the Canadian sense, it's euthanasia, so they can put more drug in, and they do. They have a second, they have the second dose as part of their package. So if you don't die that quickly, or if you're laying there and struggling and you're not dying, they can give you a second dose. Whereas assisted suicide, technically you can't do that because you have to be capable of self-administering. Obviously, if the doctor's present, why is the doctor present? Well, if they insert the second dose, what I'm getting to, the second amount of poison, in order to make sure the person died, well, that would be euthanasia. That would be, and remember, euthanasia is homicide because they did it to you, whereas assisted suicide is considered assisting a suicide because you do it to yourself. So these are the distinguishing factors.
Yeah, and the other thing is that they have deliberately set it up so that if somebody cannot self-administer easily, that the doctor can set up an IV line with some sort of technological backup with a computer or whatever, so that the patient can make the final decision whether they press a button or they blink at a camera they can make a final decision, but the doctor does everything apart from make the final decision, essentially, which is as close to euthanasia as you get, basically,
Right.
technically.
And you cannot distinguish between the two unless it's being filmed or something. It's impossible to know. It's just impossible to know whether it was euthanasia or assisted suicide. You can't know.
It
Yeah.
also means that conditions that wouldn't normally qualify in a place like Oregon, or people wouldn't be able to access it in a place like Oregon, will qualify in the UK.
Well, let's not be of any illusion. They're doing those deaths in Oregon and California. Shavelson in California has written several posts about these deaths, how they're doing it. So it's not that they're not qualified in Oregon or Washington State or California. It's just that, like, and if you look at the data, you see that they're qualified because you see there's so many of those deaths happening every year by assisted suicide in those states. So they're doing it already. They're just doing it in a self-administered manner, and they're hoping for the best.
Yeah, and the other difference between Scotland and Westminster, of course, is this requirement of a prognosis of 6 months to live, which in itself is fairly inaccurate. I think it's only in 37% of cases that doctors actually accurately predict 6 months to live in patients. But in the Scottish bill, there's no prognosis of death required at all. So you could very well have somebody with a life-shortening condition with 10, 15 years to live who would qualify, and if they were unable to self-administer because of their condition, they would still qualify.
So you mentioned about the Isle of Man earlier, and I think there's a big concern going on there. So are you able to quickly give us a rundown about what's going on in the Isle of Man and Guernsey, etc.?
Yeah, in the Isle of Man, the bill has been through both houses of the Tynwald now. It's essentially going to be going for royal assent. It is an assisted suicide bill, and you know, we will have to wait and see what comes out of the subsequent considerations in terms of guidance and things. It's been left quite a lot to the guidance of the health department there. It is a bill where the doctors have to opt in, unlike the Scottish and the Westminster bills. That came from the British Medical Association. So we will see what happens in the Isle of Man, but and Jersey as well. There was this overwhelming vote in the States Assembly there that was a bill which was initially very similar to Canada, with a track 1 and track 2
Yes.
approach. They have amended that to some degree, but it does still involve both euthanasia and assisted suicide. That will come up for a vote again. It's currently been drafted and will be published soon, and the legislation itself will be voted on in November this year.
Yeah. So, yeah, the interesting thing is, once again, now with the opt-in approach, it's most physicians will not opt in, but as you know, in a small place like Isle of Man, it really only takes one physician wanting to do it. You have one opt-in physician, and that'll be more than enough to carry it out. There's not that many people who live
one
there.
or two. Yeah, I think you probably need 2, but yes. But
Well, I mean, 2 who are willing to be on the committee, how they have it set up, but 1 who's willing to do it. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So anyway, so that's a fair amount of information. You know, I think that you might have other comments, and we can go to some questions.
Sure.
Does anybody else, does anybody with us have any questions today? You can unmute yourself and ask any questions you want to Dr. McDonald.
Well, we do have somebody on the Zoom call who is the expert in palliative care and prognostication. So if he wants to ask a question or make a comment, then I'd be very happy.
I welcome it. There is no question about it. We have time, and if it's helpful, like those who are watching in the future, they will gain from that. So so please begin.
Yeah, hi. I'm up in Scotland, although I'm most anxious about the English problem just now. I've written an editorial on BMJ out electronically just now, but it'll be in print next weekend. I don't know if you've seen it, but I'm basically saying it's impossible for GPs to identify people within 6 months because from first principles, the illness trajectories nowadays, most people take a number of years. Because the last few years I've been developing this concept of illness trajectories at the end of life. And it's true that most people take 3-4 years once they get stage 4 non-malignant illnesses. So there's some issues around that. So do look out for that editorial and maybe try to popularize it. I'll send you a copy of it, a link to it. It's BMJ.
I'm very interested in the copy when it comes out. Now, did you see the research a few years ago that was published in Ottawa of people who were diagnosed with lung cancer, and the ones who died by MAID, euthanasia, were, approximately half of them who died by euthanasia never went for, never had the concluding, how would you say, tests done to ensure they knew what kind of cancer it was, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
Because obviously some lung cancers are far more likely to be successfully treated than others, right?
Yeah.
And I thought that was powerful because it showed that it had nothing to do with, now in Canada, there's no issue of prognosis. It was a terminal condition in our law, but I mean, it didn't matter. Their prognosis might have been quite good, but they were approved for MAID and died by MAID anyway, and never were treated. And never went for further confirmations either.
But I would say that there's evidence we've generated, certainly in the UK, that it's that you can't really expect a person to die within the next 6 months. And Gordon mentioned about 37%. 37% is the positive rate of the surprise question, where a GP asks, in primary care, would I be surprised if this person died within the next year? And that is 37%. And therefore, I would reckon that most people with heart failure, lung failure, all these other things, they take 2 or 3 years to die.
Right.
And therefore, GPs who are up to date with modern concepts in palliative care cannot say that they expect a patient to die within 6 months. It's a holy grail. It's impossible.
Right.
We've developed prognostic indicators, and we also say they have now been the palliative care indicators have been disarticulated from prognosis because they don't measure that at all. It's a capacity to benefit from palliative care or need. So they mustn't use these, and I hope they will never use those in Scotland, when it comes to that. But any concepts about prognosis, is there any evidence actually have any GPs or courts actually have a checklist so they can check the working of the GPs, to say yes, because there's no protocol or guideline to prognosticate at 6 months. It does not exist in the world.
No, and it doesn't exist. And when you look at the reports, see, it's only, Washington does show you the time of death from the time of prescription, but I mean, Oregon is the only state that really carries most of that type of data. And you see that it does vary greatly. Was it last year someone lived 1,100 days after being prescribed the lethal drugs? I'm assuming that they needed to get their prescription refilled again at some point. I'm not sure. Because
I guess the point we're making that if someone is like Esther Rance or something gets a cancer, it's going to, on average, they'll take 3 or 4 years before they die. They may die in the next 6 months, they may die in the following 6 months, but really, they're equally, each 6 months is an equal sort of incidence of new deaths because of the irregular trajectory. And therefore, it's actually very unlikely. Now, I think some courts in Australia have shown that, to expect does not mean that they can't use probabilistic terminology. The courts, I think, in Queensland said that to be reasonable, on the label of the tin in England, I'm really annoyed about. It's 6 months, as though GPs can do it. No, we can't. So I'm trying to dispel that myth. It's a holy grail to do it.
Right.
And that's really, so it's another safety thing that just doesn't work. And it's another, I hope, coffin and nail that we'll be able to highlight over the next few weeks and months. And how can that best...
Scott, the history of the 6-month prognosis issue. It came from Oregon, that whole question of the 6-month prognosis. And I think that the history is quite clear that it was all based on the palliative care model. So in Oregon, in order to qualify for palliative care, you had to have had a 6-month prognosis to death in order to qualify for palliative care. And so when they were doing their assisted suicide bill, the 6-month prognosis was something that was already accepted because that was So obviously speaking, what it meant is if you didn't have a 6-month prognosis, you wouldn't qualify for funding for palliative care, right? Under the program, the funding model for healthcare.
So it was a good prognosis to have, so you would get palliative care if you want.
Right. So because it was an accepted prognosis already as
Mm.
within the law in Oregon, therefore
Yeah.
they added it to the assisted suicide bill because it was considered to be that's where it comes from. It's not.
And
It's
they
got
all
nothing to
die
do with
within
an
a year. Did
effective
they all die
prognosis.
within? So did they all die within 6 months, or did some of them actually go on for a year or 2 or 3? Because I have examples of thousands of people receiving palliative care
Right.
for 2-3 years. So obviously
So-
they didn't die when they got the
So
diagnosis.
if you email me, I'll send you the Oregon data, and you'll see that quite a few of them live longer than 6 months before they die by assisted suicide. But that's not even accurate because obviously speaking, if I legally get approved and I've got my assisted suicide poison there, I might decide at the 3-month point, well, you know, I'm going to die soon anyway, so I take the lethal poison and I'm dead. Well, I might have lived 2 years. I don't know. How can you prognosticate how long they would have lived? All you know is they're dead now.
Yeah, the same has happened in the UK, where they've looked at social security legislation where people get access to benefits.
Right.
And they've basically picked up the definitions from that. Now, the purpose of that legislation obviously is to facilitate people having maximum quality of life. And so it's generous. And but then when you then pick that up and apply it in the context of assisted suicide, which is a completely different rationale, it's quite problematic. And the same is true with the mental capacity legislation. Mental capacity legislation in the UK and England and Wales in particular is you're supposed to assume that they have capacity unless you can prove otherwise, essentially. And of course, people can have capacity for some decisions and not other decisions.
Correct.
But that again is to enhance people's lives. But then what they're now doing is applying that in facilitating their deaths, which is completely inappropriate.
Correct.
Yes, certainly in Scotland and England, people, if you talk about terminal care, most folk are talking about the last few weeks or days of life still. But it changed to a year, as Gordon said, so that more people could get relief, you know, before the very last months of life. Any comment on this word reasonable? This word by putting in the word reasonably expected, it seems to open the gates to abandon a strict criteria for prognosis.
Well, reasonable is the same idea as what happened in Canada. In Canada, they used this term. The original law was not track 1, track 2. It said that your natural death had to be reasonably foreseeable, but it was never defined. So if they don't define the term reasonable, then it has no meaning. Because what you consider reasonable and what Gordon considers reasonable might be two very different things. And who's to say otherwise? So you have to define the terminology.
I guess from first principles, reasonable would mean logical or evident, could be evidence on the basis of reason.
But it's not based on reason, it's based on a reasonable assumption. And who's to say it's not reasonable? You know, unless there is some definition, how do I define it in any way? It's not possible. Wouldn't you say, Gordon? It's just not possible to define it.
Yeah, I mean, in law normally it's what a reasonable person would deem, but I think the issue with reasonable, as you say in Canada, is that it wasn't defined. And you know, when Jocelyn Downey came to the Scottish Parliament, she said, "Oh well, the lawyers have interpreted that to mean 6 months." But you know, essentially, it was open. You know, that was just what some of the lawyers were interpreting it to be.
Exactly.
And clearly, the case that then came before the court in Quebec expanded that to track 2, as you say.
Correct.
Yeah. I'm just wondering whether we should look at some of the other comments here, Alex, and if I don't know if there are
absolutely. Let's look at the comments.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, which question did you want to deal with first, or point you want to deal with first? It says here, one suspects that UK poor mortality data relates to a pessimistic attitude towards prognosis, resource pressures, etc., and reluctance to operate. Heard some sad, fantastic stories recently, but Esther Ranson doing very well on checkpoint inhibitor. Okay, so whatever that's all about. So go on, you can comment on that. There was a UK ITV screened a feature on germinative, I can't pronounce it, patient Jessica Lance, who was 26, getting assisted death in Oregon, which to me is an expert in the field, is preposterous. Yeah, it is preposterous. Remember, you might want to comment on it, Gordon, but none of these things are meant to be to keep it tight. The concept of assisted suicide is to make it available, and the concept of the language of the law is it's to be saleable. It's to sell it to the members of parliament. The concept of the assisted dying people is, what do we have to do to get the bill to pass? That's their concern. That's their primary concern. The rest of it's of really no concern.
Yeah, and that's what we saw with the High Court provision in the Leadbeater bill. It was really just put in there to reassure people who were worried, to get them to vote for it in principle at second reading. You know, clearly it was completely impractical from the start, but it allowed her to say, oh, this is going to be the safest bill in the world, which of course is the same sort of rhetoric that we're hearing in Scotland as well. Now, what's been said in Scotland recently is, oh no, the Scottish bill is going to be the safest bill in the world. So is it going to be the Westminster bill, or is it going to be the Scottish bill that's the safest bill in the world? You know, I have to say you have to take both claims with a huge pinch of salt, I think.
Well, when New Mexico legalized assisted suicide, they said it was going to be the safest bill in the world, but I was arguing from the beginning that it was the most liberal bill in the U.S., which it was. There was no question about it. But in order to sell it in New Mexico, they said it was the safest bill in the world, and of course, it never was.
Yeah.
Right now, I would say Victoria, Australia is, but they're amending that right now. So, you know, what are you going to do? They want more killing. That's what they want. Are
The
there
other
any
thing we know, of course, is that the numbers are underestimated all the time, and so one of the reasons why in the Scottish context they picked up on Victoria was because the numbers in Victoria are small in comparison to other Australian states, and if you look at the numbers in places like Queensland or New South Wales, they're a much higher number than would be the case in you know, in Victoria, for example, simply because the law is more liberal. So I did an estimate of based on I think it was New South Wales, on the numbers that we might expect in Scotland. Now, what you've got to remember is that Liam MacArthur has said there'll be 25 deaths in the first year. That's what he estimated it to be. But when I looked at the Australian data, particularly from that state, it would be more like 440 deaths in the first year. So that shows you the amount of underestimating that's likely to be going on.
Yeah, and they do that everywhere because here in Canada, the Quebec Minister of Health said that there'd be about 100 a year. And of course, Quebec is now the most permissive place in the world. So, you know, on we go. I think that the key to all of this is, first of all, defeating the bill. And Gordon had mentioned that there was 55 more members who voted in favor at second reading than against. But many of those 55 have said, or many of the members who voted in favor said that they are not, you know, staunch on it, meaning that they would consider voting no if they felt that the final version was not up to snuff. So the key to this whole issue is what is it that they're looking for, and are they actually serious about possibly voting no? Because that's our hope for defeating it.
Yeah, I would say that obviously is our hope, but I'm equally skeptical of politicians saying that because they will often say to their constituents what they want to hear. I do think there are some of them that will vote differently at the next stage. Whether or not it's the numbers that have said publicly that they were committed to the judge safeguard, for example. I think there were something like 61 MPs who specifically cited that. I don't think we'll see all 61 of them voting against the bill because the judge safeguard has been dropped, for example.
Yeah, but you only need 28.
You only need 28, yeah. And then the other thing is, of course, that the House of Lords hopefully will go through the bill with a dose of salts, you know, because you know, clearly what's been happening at committee has thrown up lots of issues that haven't been addressed, that have just been swept under the carpet.
Yes.
And that will have to be considered if it gets to that stage.
So what happens if the House of Lords proposes amendments to the bill? Let's say I'm not wanting it to pass in Westminster, but if it were to pass in Westminster and went to the House of Lords and they proposed amendments, how would the House of Commons deal with that?
Well, what happens is the Lords, if the Lords includes amendments that the Commons, it would then have to go back to the Commons to consider those amendments. And it's at the end of the process in the Lords, they have what's called ping pong, which is essentially a period of time where the bill goes backwards and forwards, and there's a trade-off between the two houses as to which amendments the Commons will accept and which ones they won't accept. But obviously that's at the very end of the process, and we're hoping we're not going to get to that stage. But you know, there is a possibility. The Scottish Parliament doesn't have a revising chamber, of course. But the issue in Scotland, though, is slightly different because Liam MacArthur's bill has been considered by committee. They will probably be publishing the report next week or in the next couple of weeks. It will be debated at stage 1, which is a debate in principle on the 22nd or 23rd of May, I think 22nd of May, I think.
Yeah.
And but the issue with that is that Liam MacArthur has put in his bill a conscience clause and powers for Scottish ministers to approve certain substances for use. And this was because after they had taken advice from Jocelyn Downey and all sorts of people from all around the world, they decided that they wanted to have the best bill in the world and they would cover all the bases. But they sort of overlooked the fact that the Scottish Parliament doesn't actually have the power to legislate for drug licensing or medical regulation. And so the bill is arguably not legislatively competent. And that's certainly the view the Scottish Government has come to. However, the Parliament's presiding officer approved it as legislatively competent because Liam put a clause in the bill that essentially says anything which isn't devolved to Holyrood, to the Scottish Parliament, any clause which relates to reserved powers doesn't have any effect. So there's a smoke and mirrors going on here, whereby they're presenting the bill as having a conscience clause and opt-out that doctors don't have to participate. They're saying, well, there's going to be this effective system of drug regulation to make sure that you know, the Scottish Government is happy with what's being used. But actually, neither of those powers or those clauses in the bill will be effective because they are both reserved powers to Westminster unless the UK government chooses to devolve those powers to the Scottish Parliament. So I think what's likely to happen in Scotland is that there will be this debate on the 22nd of May. If the bill might well not get through and we might see it off, but if it does get through, it's then going to be paused whilst this issue of what powers the Scottish Parliament has gets sorted out. And we will have to wait and see how long that process takes.
Okay, so we have a few minutes, and Ruth has put up a question here. Ruth Enns is actually an author, longtime knowledgeable person on these issues of assisted suicide, and she writes, what about the process of persuading legislators, media, and the public to support euthanasia that's been going on by the assisted suicide lobby and assisted suicide, which is, you know, for instance, increasing numbers can be twisted to mean that such numbers represent an increase in demand, which must be met with an increase in supply. I can consistently see this topic injected into films, documentaries, other media. For instance, you had polls, etc. She says you had the whole ad campaign, for instance, going on by Dying in Dignity in the subways and in the newspapers, etc., to try and pressure politicians, etc., to legalize.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a lot of media interest in this issue, and I think clearly the media has had a big influence in terms of creating the situation where this is now being debated. It's very interesting that the more the media has thought about it and the closer they've got to the actual bill becoming law, the more the media have moved away from it. And particularly throughout the process, we've had quite a few commentators. The Times has come off the fence and is very much now arguing against the change in the law. There have been commentators in The Guardian who are saying that you know, the more they see of the process, the less they're supporting it. So I think that's really interesting, that change in the media narrative. Clearly the BBC are still, as usual, being the chief cheerleaders for assisted suicide. Although Liz Carr's documentary is going to be reshown hopefully on the 1st of April. So she obviously went to Canada, as you're aware. and
Yes, this
interviewed people
is
there.
our
So,
documentary.
so that there has been a huge onslaught really, and Dignity in Dying is a multi-million-pound operation. We've got lots of money to spend on social media advertising, on other forms of advertising as well. So we are up against it, and we know that that's the case. But ultimately, the more people think about this issue, the less likely they are to support it. And we did some polling back in October, and it showed that when people are presented with the arguments opposing euthanasia or assisted suicide, or telling them what's happening in other jurisdictions, then we see that their support changes very rapidly to opposition. And in fact, the headline figure, because Dignity in Dying are always doing these polls in which they say, well, 75–80% of the public are in favour, but the headline figure fell from 73%, I think it was, no, 75%, I think, down to just 11%. So essentially only 11% of the public are firmly committed to this. And probably around about 80% of the public are in favour in principle. When they actually think about it, they change their mind and decide that they're opposed. And it's important that we understand and remember that the public are not overwhelmingly in favour of this, despite the media narrative and despite the narrative that we hear all the time from campaigners.
I think that's very important. We have the same situation in Canada, but the difference between the Canadian debate and the UK debate is that our newspapers remained overwhelmingly in favor 2015, 2016. It wasn't until after it was legalized that there started to be some reaction that maybe this wasn't such a good thing. And now it's more specifics that they're concerned about, not the idea of the law itself. Other than the National Post seems to, funny enough, have come fully around and they seem to be opposed. Not all of their writers, but anyway, so this is the same situation. So if there's no other questions, I think we come to a close. And I think it was a very important opportunity for us to understand what's going on in the UK. And I thank Dr. McDonald for his presentation. Thank you very much. And anybody wants to send him questions can send it to info@epcc.ca, and I will share them with him. And I'm sure he's going to respond to you within reasonable time. And I didn't define reasonable, but in his case, it would probably mean pretty quick. Thank you very much, and see you again.
Thank you.